Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week of small group. We're so glad to have you along this journey through the book of Romans. I want to start by talking about when I was a kid in grade school. Maybe you were like this, but we had someone in our class who was a goody two-shoes. You know what I'm talking about? The person who was always doing the right thing and was a stickler for the rules, and they were always making sure everyone followed the rules and telling on the teacher if someone did something bad. They always made people feel bad if they weren't sort of living up to some standard. Nobody likes a goody two-shoes, right? We all hated that person. We all got so frustrated when they act like that. But reality is, in our culture, we actually hate the goody two-shoes and we love the rebel. We cheer for the one who pushes back against authority, the one who breaks the laws, right? Laws don't apply to them. They're bigger than the law. They wear the black leather jackets, ride the Harley Davidson. They drive the fast car. They play fast and loose with the rules. They're the ones who try to do what they think is right, bring about justice, fight against all of these things, even if they have to break a few laws in the process. You see, in the first few chapters of Romans, one of the main topics that Paul talks about is the law. About the idea of whether we keep the law or follow the law, or how the law applies to us, how the law condemns us. And in the same way that we don't like to follow the law, Paul is talking about this idea that the law is what condemns us. He talks about two specific groups of people, both the Jews and the Gentiles. He explains that both groups have broken God's law. Now, we use the expression God's law, but what does that really mean? When we talk about God's law, it's referring to the Old Testament, to the law that was given to Moses for the people of Israel. These were God's commandments and decrees for how the nation of Israel was to live under God's rule and authority. In fact, in the Old Testament, there were more than 600 commandments. And of course, you have the famous 10 Commandments, which were symbolic of the law as a whole. So one of the questions I want to tackle this week is, how do we as New Testament followers of Jesus relate to God's law? Maybe you've heard it said that we as Christians are no longer under the law. Oftentimes in church, we talk about the idea that Christianity is not about rules, but it's a relationship with God. But does that mean that we no longer need the law? Does that mean that God doesn't care if we follow the rules? Let's talk a little bit about the law. This week, we're specifically looking at Romans chapter 3. The Apostle Paul makes the argument that both Jews and Gentiles are guilty before God because they've broken God's laws. In fact, the Jews for thousands of years had been God's chosen people. But Paul argues that the Jews are no better off. They're still guilty before God. In fact, we're all guilty before God because we've broken the law. Now, as we think about the law, I want to read something that Jesus said about the law. This is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 19. Jesus says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Reading that makes it seem like Jesus was very passionate about the law. But now we come to Romans, and Paul is addressing both Jews and Gentiles. And in fact, many of the Jews were known for being adamant about keeping the law. The religious leaders even made up more laws to sort of put a proverbial fence around the law to keep them from even coming close to violating the law. These religious leaders were the goody two-shoes of their day, right? Nobody liked them because they kept the law. But what Paul is teaching the church in Rome about the law is important for us. What do we as New Testament believers need to do? how do we relate to God's law? In fact, sometimes, if we're honest, the Old Testament laws can be confusing for us, especially here in the New Testament, because some of the laws of the Old Testament seem like they don't apply anymore, while some of the Old Testament laws do still apply. For example, in the Old Testament book of Leviticus, it says not to wear clothes made of two kinds of material. It also says that we're not to eat shellfish, but how many of us like that cotton spandex blend? Or how many of us like to go enjoy a seafood buffet? It seems like we're just ignoring God's commandments. But then there are other commands from the Old Testament, such as do not murder, do not commit adultery, and we still follow these commandments. So what is the difference between the Old Testament law and the New Testament expectations for followers of Jesus like us? I want to explain it by talking about the three kinds of laws in the Old Testament. The first kind of law was the ceremonial laws. These laws referred to the priesthood, the sacrifices, the temple, how to be ceremonially clean, and all of these types of things. These laws are now fulfilled in Jesus Christ. They're no longer binding on us because Jesus is our priest. Jesus is our temple where we go to meet with God. Jesus is our sacrifice. Jesus is the one that makes us clean, and so on. In addition to the ceremonial laws, we have the civil laws. The civil laws are related to governing Israel as a nation ruled by God. This is called a theocracy, a nation ruled by God. But since we are no longer one nation ruled by God directly, we no longer follow the civil laws. These were insightful and helpful for us to understand how God wanted Israel to behave, but they don't directly apply to us. The third category of laws are the moral laws. Moral laws forbid such things as rape or stealing or murder. These laws are still binding on us, even in the New Testament. Even though Jesus Christ has fulfilled the requirements through his perfect sinless life, you and I are still required to follow the moral laws. So, for example, out of the 10 Commandments, we have at least 9 of them in the New Testament that are all affirmed, with the Sabbath law being the one exception that's not specifically stated in the New Testament. So we follow these because they're part of the moral law, while we can forget about or ignore the civil laws and the ceremonial laws that do not apply to us any longer. Now, when talking about the law, it's important to note that above everything, God is most concerned about your heart. In Romans chapter 2, Paul makes this very clear. Romans 2, I want to read for you verses 28 and 29, where Paul says, "For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter." So Paul is explaining, as always, that God looks at the heart. You see, the Jewish people had these outward symbols of their spirituality. They had circumcision. The Jewish people had these outward physical expressions that they were good enough to follow the law. But Paul is saying that God no longer cares about these outward things. He cares about what's happening on the inside. And in Romans chapter 3, Paul's making it clear that the Jews no longer have this advantage as his chosen people. They're just as guilty and deserving as punishment as the rest of mankind. And so I love where Romans chapter 3 says, "No one is righteous, no, not even one." Paul sort of summarizes his whole thought here that both Jews and Gentiles have broken the law. They've violated God's commandments. Everyone has sinned. Both Jews and Gentiles have violated and broken God's laws. In Romans chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, there's another significant statement about the law. Paul writes, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. It's clear that everyone has broken God's laws, and everyone will be held accountable for that. The law, in fact, Paul says, can't make anyone right with God. The law only shows us how guilty we are before God because it sets a standard, and we've broken that standard. Now, I want to go back to Jesus' words for a second in Matthew chapter 5. In verse 20, Jesus says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." If you think for a moment, this is a shocking statement. The scribes and Pharisees were the ones who were known for keeping the letter of the law. They were the goody two-shoes. How could anyone attain a standard of righteousness that was higher than theirs? It seems like Jesus is saying that following the law is essential for entering into his kingdom. But if we look at it, those religious leaders, the Pharisees and scribes, they had a fake external righteousness that was based on the law. But Jesus was more concerned with a righteousness of the heart. The scribes and Pharisees were concerned with external rules and conformity to the law in a superficial way. As long as everything on the outside looked good, then it didn't matter what was happening in their hearts. Jesus, however, is much more concerned about what's going on the inside than the outside. Here's the problem, if we boil it down. We're all guilty under the law. None of us are able to keep the law perfectly. We all stand condemned before a holy God. And what is our relationship to the law? Well, we're still required to keep the moral law of God, and yet we fail. And that is why the gospel is such good news. See, the only way we can be right with God on the inside and the outside is through faith in Jesus. Jesus Christ is the only one who lived a perfect, sinless life. And when we trust in Jesus Christ by faith, putting our faith in him, his righteousness is actually credited to our account. God no longer looks at us and sees our sin. He doesn't see Kyle the sinner. He sees Kyle the saint, because now the righteousness of Jesus Christ has been placed upon me. He sees the righteousness in your life when you've trusted in Christ. Reality is, you and I are the rebel. Jews, Gentiles, all of us have violated God's command. We've broken his laws inside and out. We've all pushed back against his perfect plan for our lives. And our only hope is the good news of the gospel. That's why I love this series, because it is good news that we can be free. We're free to walk in righteousness with God. We don't have to follow God's laws in order to earn his favor. We have his favor because of what Jesus has done. But we're free to walk in his laws as a response of love and worship, a response for everything that God has done for us. Let's strive to be obedient to the law of God, not because we have to earn favor with God, but because we love him and want to please him.